It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday. Families filled the wide hallways of one of Colorado's busiest malls. Children laughed near toy stores, shoppers carried bags filled with back-to-school sales, and parents paused for coffee as the hum of voices blended into the background. But hidden within that ordinary noise, something unthinkable was about to happen. Two toddlers, siblings barely old enough to understand the world around them, vanished in the space of a few short minutes. They were there one moment, clinging to their mother's side, and gone the next. No scream, no struggle that anyone could recall, no clear trace of where they had gone. Panic erupted. Strangers joined in the search, security shut down the exits, and law enforcement rushed to the scene. Yet despite the chaos, the children were nowhere to be found. It was as if the mall itself had swallowed them whole. What began as a desperate search quickly grew into one of the most haunting mysteries the state had ever seen. Questions flooded the air. How could two children disappear in broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of people? Who had been watching them? And why was there so little evidence to follow? The disappearance of the toddlers in the year 2000 would grip Colorado, and later, the nation. It would shatter a family, terrify a community, and leave investigators chasing shadows for decades. And when the truth finally began to emerge years later, it revealed something darker, more disturbing, than anyone could have imagined. The morning began like so many others. The family had planned a simple day out. Nothing more than a few errands, a quick stop at the toy store, and perhaps lunch before heading back home. The air outside the mall was crisp, the kind of late summer Colorado morning when the sun rises bright against the mountains, and families pour into town centers to shop, talk, and spend time together. The parents parked their car not far from the main entrance, guiding their little ones by the hand. The children, two toddlers full of energy and innocence, skipped forward with the kind of excitement only a mall could spark in a child. Rows of brightly colored toys, food courts filled with the smell of pizza and pretzels, and the promise of a small treat if they behaved. Inside, the mall was alive with movement. Stores blared pop music from the early 2000s. Teenagers lingered in groups near the arcade, mothers pushed strollers through department store aisles, and sales associates called out to passing shoppers. The toddlers' wide eyes absorbed it all, pulling at their mother's sleeve, pointing toward window displays crowded with dolls and stuffed animals. To their parents, it was all routine. A Saturday like countless others before it. They stopped first at a clothing store, picking out a few items while keeping a careful eye on their children. The little ones wandered only a few steps away, laughing and circling around racks of clothes. They were too young to stray far, too innocent to know danger. The father joked about lunch plans, the mother juggled bags and a stroller, and for a brief moment, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Strangers passed by without notice. Security guards stood at their posts. Cameras mounted above the halls scanned the crowds as they always did. No one, neither the parents nor the shoppers around them, nor the security watching from a distance, could have known that in less than an hour, this ordinary family trip would turn into a nightmare. What felt so safe, so familiar, would become a scene of chaos, confusion, and questions that would echo for decades. At first, it was nothing unusual. The toddlers wandered only a few feet away from their mother, giggling as they circled around a rack of children's clothes. She called to them gently, her eyes darting between the shirts in her hand and the two small figures within sight. For a moment, all was calm. But then the first gap. Perhaps 10, maybe 15 seconds where her eyes were elsewhere. A pause, no longer than it takes to refold a shirt, adjust a bag, or greet another shopper. When she looked back, she saw only empty space. At 11:07 a.m., the toddlers were last seen near the entrance of the children's store. By 11:09, they were gone. Witnesses later recalled seeing two children, hand in hand, being led quickly toward the main concourse. Others swore they remembered nothing at all, just the blur of weekend shoppers passing by. The mother's voice rang out first, sharp and urgent. At 11:10, she was calling their names, her tone breaking into panic. Shoppers turned their heads, security guards glanced over, but no one understood the urgency, until seconds stretched into minutes. By 11:12, store employees were alerted. Managers radioed security. The mall's loud, constant chatter began to fracture into murmurs, questions, and uneasy glances. A child missing? Two children missing? Surely they had only wandered to the next store. Surely this was nothing more than a misunderstanding. At 11:15, surveillance cameras were pulled up by the mall's security office. The grainy black and white footage showed the children, tiny, hard to make out, moving near the food court. And then nothing. A blind spot. A sudden disappearance behind the flow of bodies. By 11:18, panic was no longer confined to the family. Security guards began sealing exits, checking stairwells, elevators, and maintenance doors. One shopper later recalled, "People were still laughing and talking, shopping like normal. They had no idea what was happening just a few feet away." At 11:20, the announcement went out over the mall's internal radios. Possible child abduction in progress. The words that no parent, no officer, no community ever wants to hear. The mother's cries grew louder, her voice cracking, echoing off tiled walls as she begged strangers for help. The father rushed from store to store, tearing through aisles, searching faces. Their desperation drew a crowd. Within minutes, dozens of strangers joined the search, calling out the toddlers' names, scanning every corner, every restroom, every hallway. And yet, despite the lockdown, despite the chaos, despite hundreds of eyes turning toward the exits and entrances, no one saw the children leave. It was as if they had simply vanished. Shoppers interviewed later described the moment as surreal. One second the kids were there, the next second they weren't. People were running everywhere, guards were shouting into radios, and still, nothing. At 11:30, just 23 minutes after the toddlers were last seen, the first call reached the local police. Within minutes, the case that would come to haunt Colorado for decades had officially begun. 2 children. A crowded mall. Dozens of witnesses. And yet no answers. Only silence. Only absence. A disappearance that defied explanation. Within 15 minutes of the first call, the mall was in lockdown. The exits, once wide open to weekend shoppers, were suddenly sealed with uniformed guards standing shoulder to shoulder. Shoppers who had come for bargains and food court meals now found themselves in the middle of a desperate search. Police cars swarmed the parking lot, their sirens cutting through the chatter of confused onlookers. Officers poured into the building, radios crackling, barking orders as they split into teams. Some scoured every restroom stall, others rushed down into maintenance corridors, while others reviewed the mall's limited CCTV system frame by frame. By 11:45, K-9 units were on the ground. Search dogs, trained to track the scent of missing children, darted through the echoing corridors, noses pressed low, handlers running to keep up. The scent was there, faint but present, leading them in jagged lines through clothing stores, across the food court, and finally toward the east exit. And then inexplicably it vanished. Detectives arrived not long after, quickly setting up a command post inside the mall's security office. Maps were laid out, timelines scribbled, every second accounted for. Witnesses were pulled aside, their voices trembling as they described what little they had seen. 2 small children by the fountain, a man walking quickly ahead of them, a woman with a stroller, maybe leading them away, or maybe it was nothing. The stories conflicted. Details blurred together. Nothing was certain. Outside, television cameras had already gathered. News vans crowded the lot, anchors broadcasting live updates as confused shoppers streamed out of the mall behind them. The disappearance of 2 toddlers in broad daylight inside a crowded public place was too shocking to ignore. Colorado was watching within the hour. By evening, the nation would be watching too. But no one felt the weight of those moments more than the parents. The mother, her voice breaking, pleaded with officers, begging them to search again, to check corners already searched, to find her children. The father's anger spilled over, at himself, at the crowd, at the sheer impossibility of what had happened. "They were right here. They were right here," he repeated, as though saying it enough times would force reality to bend back into place. Detectives tried to calm them, assuring them that the lockdown would prevent anyone from taking the children beyond the mall's walls. But as each minute passed without answers, hope gave way to dread. For every door checked, every car stopped, every bag inspected, there were still no children. By noon, the mall that had been buzzing with weekend life was transformed into a crime scene. Officers with clipboards interviewed shoppers one by one. Helicopters circled overhead. Parking lots were searched row by row. Nothing. No trace. In less than an hour, an ordinary shopping trip had become every parent's nightmare. And for investigators, the beginning of a case that would consume years of their lives. 2 children, lost in plain sight. A family shattered. And a community left asking a question no one could yet answer. How could this happen here? By the afternoon, The case had escalated beyond local law enforcement. The FBI was called in, their child abduction task force arriving to take control of what was rapidly becoming one of the most urgent disappearances in Colorado's history. Command centers were established both inside the mall and at the local police precinct. Phones rang constantly, maps of the surrounding area were pinned to walls, and every available officer was ordered into the field. From the very beginning, investigators knew time was their enemy. In child abduction cases, the first hours are the most critical, the difference between rescue and tragedy. Every second without answers only widened the distance between the missing toddlers and those searching for them. The first wave of suspicion fell, as it often does, close to home. The parents were questioned repeatedly, where they had been, who they had seen, whether they had noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the disappearance. But their anguish, raw and visible, quickly redirected attention outward. Attention then shifted to those inside the mall itself. A janitor, who had been seen near the children earlier that morning, became one of the first persons of interest. He denied any involvement, insisting he had been cleaning stairwells during the critical minutes, but investigators pressed him for inconsistencies. Shoppers claimed they had seen an unidentified man, tall, wearing a baseball cap, leading two children by the hand toward an exit. Another claimed she saw a woman pushing a stroller with children who looked out of place. But when asked for details, her memory blurred. The color of the stroller, the woman's hair, even the exact location seemed to dissolve under pressure. As the hours turned into evening, the floodgates opened. Sightings came in from every corner of the city. A gas station clerk swore he saw two children matching the description near the pumps. A driver reported a man loading toddlers into the back of a van. Each lead carried urgency, and each one consumed precious manpower. But again and again, hope gave way to frustration. The gas station footage revealed nothing but a family on vacation. The van described by the driver was never found, and the report later dismissed as unreliable. And then came the cruelest distractions of all, prank calls, anonymous voices claiming to know where the children were, only to vanish when investigators pressed for proof. Every false lead chipped away at the morale of the teams working around the clock. By the end of the first day, detectives were left with nothing concrete. A handful of conflicting witness statements. A janitor whose story couldn't be disproven. An unknown man in a baseball cap. A woman with a stroller who may or may not have existed. The children were still missing. And for investigators, one haunting truth was becoming clear. Whoever had taken them had managed to slip through one of the largest search efforts the state had ever mounted. The case that had begun in the heart of a bustling shopping mall was already spiraling into a maze of confusion, dead ends, and shadows. In the beginning, the case dominated headlines. Every television station carried the story. Every newspaper splashed the children's faces across their front pages. But as weeks turned to months, the urgency of the media began to fade. Other stories rose to take its place, and soon, what had once been breaking news became only a brief mention, buried in the back of local broadcasts. But for the parents, the fight never slowed. Each morning they woke to the same reality. Their children were gone, and the world seemed to be moving on without them. They appeared on talk shows, spoke at press conferences, and pleaded with the public for information. They handed out flyers in grocery store parking lots, taped posters to lampposts and shop windows, and refused to let the world forget. The community responded in the only way it knew how. Vigils were held in the town square, candles flickering against the night sky as neighbors gathered to pray, to sing, and to grieve alongside the family. Strangers donated money, organized search parties, and later helped establish a foundation in the children's names, an organization dedicated to helping other families facing the same nightmare. For a time, that foundation became a beacon of hope, a way of turning tragedy into action. But behind the public appearances and the community support, the family's private struggles told a harsher story. The strain of endless waiting began to fracture their lives. Nights were spent in sleepless cycles of fear and guilt. Days blurred together in interviews, meetings with detectives, and empty searches. The parents' marriage began to crumble under the weight of unanswered questions. Grief seeped into every corner of their lives, and even moments of silence became unbearable reminders of what had been lost. One interview years later captured the father's despair. His voice low, he admitted, "It felt like we were screaming into a void. The world kept turning, but for us, time stopped the moment they disappeared." And yet, while public attention waned and the case slipped from the front page, for investigators it was never closed. The files remained on their desks, the photographs of the toddlers pinned to their walls. Every new lead, no matter how faint, was pursued. Every call that came into the tip line was logged, no matter how improbable. The trail may have gone cold, but the silence was deceptive. Because somewhere, someone knew the truth. And the investigators knew that all it would take was one mistake, one overlooked clue, to bring the answers that had eluded them for years. For years, the case gathered dust, boxed files stacked on shelves, grainy surveillance tapes locked away, interviews archived and forgotten. But time, which once seemed like the enemy, would ultimately become an unexpected ally. Nearly a decade later, the FBI returned to the case, armed with new tools that hadn't existed in 2000. Forensic technology had advanced. Old pieces of evidence, tiny traces that once seemed useless, were sent back to the lab. DNA testing, far more precise than in the early days, began to reveal hints investigators had never seen before. Even the original security footage, degraded and blurred, was enhanced with modern software. Faces once lost in shadow began to emerge. Movements once too quick to notice became visible, piece by piece, frame by frame. Then came the witness. A man, older now, who had been at the mall that day. For years he had convinced himself what he saw wasn't important, or perhaps that his memory had been playing tricks on him. But guilt has a way of resurfacing. He came forward, telling investigators about a fleeting moment he could no longer ignore. Two small children being hurried through a side corridor, guided not by their parents, but by someone else. A figure he could never forget, even after all this time. His statement reignited the investigation, and when compared with the enhanced footage, a new narrative began to take shape. The FBI noticed patterns, similarities to another case hundreds of miles away. A disappearance in a neighboring state, almost identical in its details. Young children taken in a public place, minimal evidence, and suspects who seemed to vanish into thin air. The possibility could no longer be ignored. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were connected. With this link, the case transformed from a cold file into something far more urgent. Teams worked around the clock, cross-referencing witnesses, DNA, and movements across state lines. And what they uncovered, hidden for years beneath layers of oversight and silence, would leave both investigators and the public stunned. Because this was no ordinary abduction. The truth, when it finally came to light, was darker, deeper, and more disturbing than anyone had dared to imagine. And for the first time in years, there was a real chance to uncover what had happened to the children inside that Colorado mall. The breakthrough came suddenly after years of darkness. Armed with warrants, surveillance, and months of careful planning, the FBI moved in. What began quietly, with unmarked vehicles slipping into position under cover of night, would soon erupt into one of the most dramatic raids the state had ever witnessed. At dawn, the silence shattered. Tactical teams swept into a secluded property tied to the investigation, their voices echoing through the air. FBI, open the door. Before breaching the entrance with calculated precision. The thud of boots on the floorboards, the shouts of agents clearing rooms, the metallic slam of cuffs snapping into place. Every moment was charged with the possibility of answers long denied. Inside, agents found more than they expected. Hidden rooms, boxes of belongings, objects too small, too personal, to be anything but children's. Toys, shoes, faded clothing that seemed out of place, as though it had belonged to someone who was never meant to leave. The property was secured in minutes, but the weight of what they had uncovered would last a lifetime. For the first time since that day in 2000, investigators could feel the truth pressing against them, close, tangible, almost within reach. But with every box opened, every door forced wide, the horror deepened. This was not the work of a lone figure, not a simple crime of opportunity. It was something larger, something darker. And as evidence was cataloged and suspects were hauled away in silence, the agents knew the story of the Colorado mall disappearance was about to take a chilling new turn. The discovery was only the beginning. As agents searched deeper into the property, the scope of the crime began to reveal itself. At first, it was the small things, items that could have belonged to anyone. A pair of children's sneakers tucked into a dusty box. A stuffed bear, its fur worn thin, with a name stitched faintly across the tag. But as investigators opened one container after another, the coincidences became impossible to deny. There were dozens of items, tiny shirts folded with care, lunchboxes decorated with cartoon characters from the early 2000s, photographs with faces blurred or torn away. Each discovery carried the same weight. These were not relics of some forgotten family. They were evidence. Evidence of children who had vanished without a trace. Then came the files. Hidden in drawers and locked cabinets were documents that mapped something larger, something organized. Names, dates, travel routes, phone numbers tied to out-of-state addresses. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not the isolated crime of a single kidnapper. It was part of a network. Whispers that investigators had feared for years were suddenly made real. Trafficking. Children taken from public places, passed across state lines, absorbed into a system designed to erase them. The evidence pointed to a ring that had operated in shadows, invisible yet in plain sight, its tracks scattered across the country. The Colorado case was no longer just a mystery. It was a window into something darker, more horrifying than anyone had been prepared to admit. Each new box of belongings, each note in the files, was a reminder that these were not just objects, not just numbers. They were lives. And in that moment, the disappearance of the two toddlers was no longer seen as an isolated tragedy, but part of a chilling truth. They were not the first, and they would not have been the last. When news of the raid broke, it spread like wildfire. Within hours, local broadcasts cut into regular programming with urgent updates. Anchors with solemn expressions told the nation what investigators had uncovered. A property tied to missing children, evidence linking the Colorado Mall disappearance to a suspected trafficking network. What had once been a quiet, cold case buried in the archives of memory was suddenly thrust back into the spotlight, this time with horrifying clarity. Families who had long since given up hope found themselves glued to their televisions, wondering if the names in those files might include their children. Outside the FBI field office, cameras crowded the sidewalks. Reporters shouted questions as officials gave carefully worded statements, their voices straining to remain calm under the weight of public demand. Headlines screamed across newspapers and television screens. FBI uncovers disturbing trafficking network. Cold case breaks wide open. Were the missing children taken for profit? Communities across the nation reacted with outrage. Parents looked at their children differently that night, clutching their hands tighter in malls, parks, and grocery stores. Towns held vigils not just for the two toddlers from Colorado, but for every missing child whose face had been taped to a telephone pole or printed on a milk carton. The discovery ignited a storm. Talk shows, radio programs, and newspaper editorials dissected every detail. Politicians demanded answers, calling for stronger laws, more oversight, and harsher penalties. Advocacy groups seized the moment to shine a light on the hidden epidemic of child trafficking, an issue long ignored, now impossible to look away from. For the parents of the missing toddlers, the sudden media firestorm was bittersweet. Their story, once fading into silence, had been reborn in the most shocking way imaginable. And while the cameras captured the outrage of a nation, they knew this was not about headlines or breaking news. For them, it was about one desperate question that still hung in the air. Were their children alive, or had they been lost forever? When the arrests were made, the story shifted from the shadows of secrecy to the bright, unflinching lights of the courtroom. The trials were unlike anything the community had seen before. Families, reporters, and survivors filled the benches, their eyes fixed on the accused as they were led in shackled, stone-faced, and silent. Prosecutors laid out a chilling case. Evidence collected from the raid, photographs, DNA samples, and files documenting years of calculated abductions. Jurors were shown the children's belongings, the small shoes, the toys, the clothing, each item a haunting reminder of innocence stolen. Defense attorneys attempted to sow doubt, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that the connections were weak, that memory and time had distorted the facts. But the FBI's meticulous work, the chain of evidence, and the testimony of witnesses painted a far darker picture. Legal analysts on television dissected every move, every objection, every ruling. Commentators spoke of precedent, of the case's significance in exposing trafficking rings hidden in plain sight. For many watching, this was not just a trial of individuals. It was a trial of a system that had allowed such horrors to go unseen for so long. And as the proceedings unfolded, the parents of the missing toddlers sat silently in the front row, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, grief, and hope. After years of not knowing, they were finally watching justice take shape before their eyes. But the answers they wanted most, what had truly happened to their children, remained painfully out of reach. Then the turning point, confession tapes. In dimly lit interrogation rooms, suspects began to speak. Some offered only fragments, others full admissions, their words chilling in their calmness. They described how children were lured, how they vanished into hidden systems, how silence was bought and enforced. The FBI released carefully edited statements to the public. Agents stood before microphones, their tone measured, but the gravity unmistakable. This case exposed a network that operated in our communities for years. Today, that network is broken. For investigators who had lived with the case since 2000, it was both vindication and heartbreak. They had answers, but those answers carried a weight that could never be lifted. The tapes were not just evidence, they were echoes of lives interrupted, voices that could never return. Asterisk, in the end, justice came. Not swiftly, not easily, but it came. Convictions were handed down. Sentences stretched into lifetimes. And though no verdict could return what was lost, the courtroom's final gavel carried with it the weight of closure. For the parents, it was a bittersweet victory. They had fought for decades, endured silence, doubt, and despair. And while the trial could not answer every question, it did ensure that those responsible would never walk free again. Across the nation, the case left scars and lessons. It forced communities to confront the hidden dangers around them, to question how something so dark could exist in the open. It reshaped how law enforcement pursued trafficking, and how the public understood the stories behind missing children's posters. As the cameras faded and the headlines slowed, one truth remained: justice had come late, but it had come. And though the mystery of what truly happened to the two toddlers inside that Colorado mall may never be fully solved, their disappearance changed the country forever. More than 2 decades have passed since that day in 2000, but for the parents, time has never truly healed the wound. They live with absence every morning they wake, every holiday, every birthday that came and went without their children. Some have chosen to remain private, retreating from the cameras, guarding what little peace they have left. Others have turned their grief into action. Foundations for missing children, advocacy work, speaking to other families who live the nightmare of not knowing. They keep the photos close, still framed on mantles or tucked in wallets. They mark anniversaries quietly, sometimes at vigils, sometimes alone. And though the world has moved forward, for them, the calendar never changes. When asked how they cope, their answers are soft, often carried on tears. "You don't move on," one parent says. "You just learn to carry it." For the families, survival has meant creating meaning in the face of the unbearable. They live with the hope, fragile, flickering, that somewhere, somehow, their children know they were loved beyond measure. And for the investigators, the case remains not just a file, not just a story, but a reminder that behind every headline, every photograph, there are parents who wait, who search, who never stop hoping. For the agents who worked the case, the memories have never faded. Some were young investigators in 2000, now veterans nearing retirement. Others joined the task force years later, drawn into a mystery that had already consumed so many lives. In interviews, they speak with a mixture of pride and regret. Pride that the case was finally cracked, that a network exploiting children was exposed. Regret that it took so long, that answers came too late for families who had waited half a lifetime. They admit the mistakes, the missed clues, the lack of coordination between agencies in the early years. And they acknowledge what those failures cost, not just in time, but in lives. But they also talk about change, how the case reshaped the FBI's approach to missing children, how data-sharing systems were rebuilt, how surveillance, DNA analysis, and interagency communication became sharper, faster, and stronger because of what went wrong here. And when asked what stays with them most, the answers are simple. Not the files, not the evidence, but the faces of the children, of the parents, of the lives forever changed. For the FBI, this case will always be a reminder. Justice must never come too late again. The disappearance of the two toddlers and the revelations that followed left a permanent mark on the nation. Out of tragedy came change, measures designed to ensure that what happened in Colorado would never be repeated. The Amber Alert system, still in its infancy in 2000, was rapidly expanded in the years after. Today, a child's disappearance can trigger immediate nationwide alerts. Phones buzzing, highway signs flashing, broadcasters breaking into regular programming within minutes. It is a system built on the lessons of cases like this, where every lost second once meant a lost child. Malls and shopping centers also changed. Security cameras, once grainy and sparse, became standard, upgraded to high-definition systems covering every corner, every corridor. Staff were trained differently, taught to recognize suspicious behavior, to act quickly, to never dismiss a parent's fear as panic. What began as an unimaginable loss in a single Colorado mall rippled outward, reshaping how America protects its children in public spaces. And while no system is perfect, each alarm that sounds, each security upgrade made, carries with it the echo of a question born in 2000. What if we had been ready then? The answer came too late for two toddlers. But for countless children since, those changes have meant the difference between vanishing and coming home. In the end, it always comes back to them. Two small children, a brother and sister, who walked into a mall on an ordinary day in the year 2000 and never came out. Their photographs still smile with innocence, frozen in time. Candlelight vigils continue to glow in their memory, each flame a symbol of love that never died, of questions that never found answers. The case changed laws, changed security, changed the way an entire nation thinks about the safety of its children. But for their families, the legacy is simpler, more heartbreaking. An empty room, a missing laugh, a future that never was. As the music swells and the final images fade, one truth remains. Justice came, but peace never did. And the haunting memory of two toddlers lost in a Colorado mall will forever remind us that some stories never truly end.